topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart.
Hello, and welcome to It's Your Voice, the show that hosts enriching conversations in diversity. My name is Bahia Yakzan. I'm a diversity educator and a core alignment coach. I support organizations and individuals and getting clear about what their values are and making sure they can align their actions with their values. This usually means helping people recognize patterns of bias that are hurting themselves and everyone else and cultivating new neural pathways, literally to develop new habits so that we can act on patterns that are far more inclusive and create more belonging and truly benefit everyone around them. Today, I am honored to have a very learned scholar with us, Sasha Abramsky, as my guest, who's written at least 9 books. I would like you to, I'm going to read a little short bio and invite you out here while I'm reading a piece of your bio and then ask you to add anything else you want folks to know about you. The title of this conversation is What is the Fate of American Democracy Now? Very relevant. And I just want to let folks know Sasha Abramsky is a British-born freelance journalist and author who now lives in the United States. He's written several hundred articles, essays, and editorials, which have appeared in many publications, including The Guardian and The Observer and the Sunday Telegraph in the UK, The Nation, The Atlantic Monthly, The New Yorker Online, The Village Voice, Rolling Stones. And I want to just mention a few of the titles of your books: Chaos Comes Calling, The Battle Against the Far Right, The American Way of Poverty, How the Other Half Still Lives, The House of 20,000 Books, which I believe is about your grandparents, Jumping at Shadows, The Triumph of Fear and the End of the American Dream, and a biography. And little wonder, this sounds a little different. The Fabulous Story of Lottie Dodd, and the world's first female sports superstar. And I understand you've traveled over 50 countries, and I'm lucky that you live in the same town I do and you teach at the university, UC Davis.
Yep, I do. And it's good to be on your show, Bahia.
Thank you. What do you think might be important for our listeners and viewers? Anything you want to add that you would like people to know about you or your work or your focus?
No, I think you were pretty comprehensive there, and I was almost embarrassed by the depth of your introduction. But look, I write on social justice themes, and I've, for 30 years, been exploring the fissures that are doing damage in American economics, politics, culture, and so on. And I'm usually interested in what happens not at the top of the economy or society, but what happens further down the food chain when vulnerable people, get caught up in all these big historical forces. And I think at the moment that's particularly relevant. You've got these sort of massive changes occurring in the politics of the country, very demagogic political rhetoric coming out from DC, and will be coming out for the next several years. And the people who get hurt the most, it's asylum seekers, it's refugees, it's desperate undocumented immigrants who've tried to come to America because their families are starving or at risk of extreme violence. And those are the ones who bear the brunt when our politics goes crazy. And that's what fascinates me. So I think that's, what I'd add into your introduction.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I I think this might be my first like post 2024 election conversation to sort of help us like digest and process the change that is occurring at the top of the U.S. government, since we not only impact the most vulnerable in our country, but many other countries are impacted by what the U.S. does or doesn't do in our alignments or lack of alignments with other countries. But I wanted to just start with the basics of like, I know it was a recurring theme from the left of let's not lose our democracy. Be careful. The democracy is threatened at the moment if we indeed elect the far right president-elect who we have now elected. So I thought it might be helpful, and partly, let me just say, because I have lived in a country that was a kingdom that was run by a king for 3 years, and I've lived in a country that was run by a dictator for 2 years. And I realize I have a strong sense of what it's like to be in a country that is not democratic. But a lot of Americans don't have that contrasting experience. So I thought it might be helpful if you can just, I mean, this might sound really basic, but just help us understand what is a democracy and what are we at risk of losing?
Well, at the most basic level, a democracy is something where the political institutions are responsive to the people, not just to a sort of popular sector of the people, but rights are respected. It's a law-based, rule-based society. It's a society where institutions are designed not to meet the needs of the ruler, but to meet the needs of the people. And in the American context, it's a society defined by foundational documents, in our case, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the amendments to the Constitution. By contrast, an autocracy, whether it's literally a dictatorship of one person or a dictatorship of a cadre of people at the top, isn't rule-based, it's regime-based. So, we have administrations here that change every 4 years. Regimes aren't like that. Regimes are designed to milk a country or milk a society for resources, basically. You see a flowing upwards of wealth to the people right at the top. You see a sort of nexus of corruption where laws are being used and institutions of government are being used to personally benefit a handful of people, a ruling elite, a family at the top, their associates, their underlings, and so on. When you said you lived in a country or a couple countries that were non-democratic, and that maybe Americans don't realize, what that means. At the most basic level, what it means is that rights that were taken for granted suddenly become fragile, that everything becomes the favor of the ruling class, that, maybe you're not prosecuted, but that's a favor. Maybe your rights aren't taken away, but that's a favor. Maybe you maintain economic well-being, but that's a favor. Everything becomes a series of trade-offs with that ruling elite. And, there's a real risk. I mean, it's not inevitable that, it's possible that there will be fight back against this, but there's a real risk, given Trump's temperament, given the things he's said, given the promises he's made on the campaign trail, that this will be years and years of retribution-based government. You prosecuted me, well, I'm going to prosecute you. I don't like the way that you let immigrants in, so I'm going to penalize immigrants. This series of things that go beyond normal politics. And you end up in a situation where very powerful institutions of state, whether it's the Justice Department or the military or the intelligence agencies, get turned inward, and they get turned against US residents and US citizens. And, we have that specter now that Trump has sort of promised, I'm going to unleash the military on immigrants. Well, if you unleash the military on immigrants, or if you unleash the military on US political protesters or dissenters or politicians you don't like, you're crossing a Rubicon. You're crossing a line into something very, very different from what the American experience has been before. And when that line's crossed, it's really hard to roll it back. Because once you embark down this route where, the executive has such extreme authority to go after enemies, to go after dissidents and so on, very, very quickly that society starts resembling Putin's Russia or Erdogan's Turkey or Viktor Orban's Hungary, something totally different from what we like to think of ourselves when we think of what the American experience means in history. And I think that that's the risk, that we're on the edge of this abyss where we have a political leadership now that doesn't respect boundaries, doesn't respect limits, and really, frankly, doesn't respect the rule of law in any way, shape, or form. It views all of this as instrumental.
Yeah, and speaking of not respecting the rule of law, it's, I was going to say interesting, but also frightening, although I practice not staying in fear. It's just like amazing to see how many of the appointee nominations, is that the right term for cabinet and heads of departments, have a criminal record, and it just seems almost like ridiculously like in your face to those who believe in the rule of law, and not to mention extremely insulting, especially so many with like sexual assault accusations, and it's just kind of confounding and just like, really, is this really happening in America right now? Are you serious? So it's I mean, now I'm laughing. It's pretty upsetting and nerve-wracking, but I just wanted to see what you want to say about that kind of in-your-faceness, boldness, audacity that I think helped bring Trump to the point where he's now the president-elect.
I think that what we're seeing here is, as you said, it's this very in-your-face, full-frontal assault, not just on the institutions of state, but on the sort of infrastructure of decency. And it transcends left-wing, right-wing. It's really this idea that Trump's basically trying to bring institutions of state to heel, institutions that he doesn't trust, especially the Justice Department. Well, what better way to do that than to bring in people in leadership roles who are manifestly unqualified, not just unqualified, but antithetical to the mission of the Justice Department. So if the mission of the Justice Department is upholding the rule of law, and you nominate Matt Gaetz, who's under investigation or was under investigation for sex trafficking, for having sex with underage minors, for drug-fueled orgies and all of this stuff, well, you're sending a very, very clear message that from here on in, the Justice Department isn't about the rule of law. It's going to be a creature of the president. It's going to be a personal creature of Donald Trump. And if you don't like it, get out of the way, because the leadership's going to come in and it's going to fire people who are professional. It's going to fire the people who actually do follow the rules of law. Well, I mean, that's catastrophic. The idea that someone like Matt Gaetz could be anywhere near controlling the Justice Department or any other government agency is just a scandal. And the fact that Trump would use political capital before he's even assumed the White House again, that he would use so much political capital on this, it tells you the direction he's trying to take the country and the administration. That, this isn't about competent governments. This is the reverse. This is about putting in place wrecking balls who are going to go into those departments and literally eviscerate them. Whether they formally dissolve institutions or whether they just drive qualified people out of work. What they're aiming to do is make large parts of the government non-functional. And then if you sort of tie it in with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy's ambition, I mean, this idea that you can appoint a non-elected group of billionaires, including the richest man on earth, to scrub government of about a third of its dollars, which is what they're talking about doing. Well, you can do it, but you're going to get rid of vital nutritional programs, vital healthcare programs, vital retirement programs, vital housing programs, and you're going to leave the surviving government incapable of responding to emergencies. So yes, you can do it, but next time there's a hurricane or an earthquake, FEMA will be dysfunctional. Next time there's a pandemic, well, between the cuts that have been put in place and the hiring of public health officials such as Robert Kennedy to dismantle from within, next time there's a pandemic, there won't be an aggressive public health response. So you can get those cuts in place, but you do it at a staggering cost to the well-being of society. And I think that's what we're facing. We're facing basically a wrecking ball from within. And that's not conservative. I mean, I know we talk about this as a sort of conservative moment. That is revolutionary. It's right-wing revolutionary, but it's revolutionary in the same way that fascist movements in the 30s in Europe weren't conservative by any real understanding. They were revolutionary. It's about destroying and then building something anew. And the something anew that they're looking to build is deeply unpleasant and deeply antithetical to at least modern American values.
And just one side effect, if it just amazes me that if these wrecking balls are successfully put into place in departments like Department of Health, Department of Education, housing, human resource programs are dismantled and cut, is there no thought about the ramifications? Like, and let me just throw in one more thing. If female bodies are forced to bring have full pregnancies and give birth to children that some of whom were raped, something over 64,000 births were came from women who were victims of rape, and just in the last couple of years. Is there no thought or care about what's happening to the population? Like, and I'm skipping the lives of the women, and God knows I care and think the whole anti-choice and control over women's bodies is atrocious and outrageous and cruel in itself. But look at the results that they're asking for that will come from the wrecking balls. Do they just totally not care? There will be presumably many more people being born who without people having the resources to feed them, to school them, to educate them. Like, why would they want that? What's desirable about that? Is it just they can?
I don't claim to get inside their head psychologically. I don't know why the far right in America takes the positions it takes on a lot of these issues. You talk about abortion, and there are obviously moral arguments on both sides. It's a complicated moral issue, but you're right. At the end of the day, the policies they're putting in place are going to desperately hurt women, especially poor women, especially women of color. They're not going to improve the conditions of life on the ground. In fact, all the evidence suggests when you put these extreme policies in place, you get increased mortality rates for women. You get terrible health outcomes for kids because, as you said, you've got children who are, just being taken, all the resources are being removed from the well-being of young children. So none of this is sort of a good thing for women if you're talking about abortion. If you're talking about immigration, the same thing. If you terrorize immigrant communities, you have far worse public health outcomes. You have far worse nutritional outcomes because people are scared away from applying for benefits. You have people living in slum housing who are scared of reporting the slum conditions because they know that their landlords can then report them and get them deported, or at least render them vulnerable to deportation. So on all kinds of measures, when you introduce a government that's, quote unquote, tough in the way that the Trump administration is sort of claiming to be tough, what you get is worse outcomes for the well-being of society. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't certain sectors that are going to benefit. Any autocracy makes trade-offs. Any autocracy sort of puts down at least some benefits to some groups because that's how it holds on to power. Some people benefit when there are these kind of policy changes put in place. It looks to me, and I may be wrong, but if you look at who's in the government, it's stacked full of billionaires. It's stacked full of the super wealthy, the Commerce Department, the Treasury, agriculture, interior, education, Trump himself, Elon Musk, Ramaswamy. You've got this sort of who's who of very wealthy people. Now, very wealthy people don't tend to empathize with not very wealthy people. If you're putting people who have 9 or 10 zeros in front of their income in charge of nutritional programs where literally every dollar matters, well, you're not going to get the empathic response you need. So when Trump sort of says to Elon Musk and Ramaswamy, go crazy, destroy as many government programs as you like, I'm sure Musk is going to be able to come up with ways to cut a huge amount from the federal government because he's a slash and burn kind of figure. That's what he does. He goes into companies, he overcuts, he doesn't really care what the consequences are. And then maybe later on he tries to repair the damage. Well, that's a bit late if you're removing access to nutritional programs from tens of millions of people, or you're block granting Medicaid so that millions of people suddenly have no health care. It's a bit late, a year or two in, to say, you know what, we may have gone a bit too far. But I think that's the scenario that we're going to see. We're going to see these absolutely massive cuts and sort of reimagining of the federal government, and the consequences be damned. And so, when you say, do they care about the consequences? Yes and no. They care about it for select groups, but take the populace as a whole, I don't think this is government particularly concerned with breaking eggshells.
Yes, if you're surrounded with resources, you can detach from everyone else. You can fly away.
Yeah.
So as a coach, I really when I work with people, I had to be coached myself in order to become a coach, which I really appreciate. And one of the questions that was repeatedly asked of me was, no, what do you want? You keep talking about what you don't want. What do you want? And it took a while before that penetrated my brain, like, oh, focus on what you want. And I think that matters also collectively, individually, with a group, with an organization, with large groups of society, even if we are as divided as we appear to be. I'm wondering what would be helpful for people who want to be proactive and resist actions, or it could be like one bill at a time or one nomination at a time, who are willing to do what keeps democracy alive, participate, be active, use their voices. Can you help us think about, like, what can people do to stay focused on what they want and not get stuck in fear and anxiety and depression about the election results?
I mean, that's a huge question. I'm struggling with this every day because, it's clearly not enough to say, well, look, I don't like Donald Trump. I don't like his administration. I don't like what it stands for. I think it's cruel, it's sadistic, and so on. What are the things that progressives should invest energy in? Well, there's a lot of things. We're doing a really good job at the moment of wrecking our environment. Well, progressives need to work out ways to push environmental policies to the fore again. And they need to work out ways to talk about environmental policies in a way that brings people in. Because I think one of the things we've seen in the last few years is a lot of people, especially lower down the income chain, very, very scared of change around environment. They think that it's a trade-off between environment and jobs, or environment and economic security. Well, that's actually not right. In fact, the more you protect the environment, the more you shore up your economy for the future generations. But you have to work out ways to do that in a way that doesn't leave people behind. So I think the environment's a huge one. I think human rights are a huge one. We're clearly going to enter a period where human rights at the very best take a back burner, but more likely we're going to enter a period where, for large sections of the public, we just don't think in terms of human rights anymore. For immigrants especially, the government is going to be sort of turning itself on those immigrants in a really quite horrifying way. And I think one of the things as progressive thinkers we have to do is work out ways to, again, talk about a language of human rights, of universalism. We've done that for hundreds of years. Progressives, since Thomas Paine onwards, have talked about the rights of man and the idea that you can sort of embed those rights in the way society is structured. Well, if we turn our back on that as a society today, that's a terrible thing. So, one thing is, how do we protect human rights? How do we define, expand those human rights, and then really protect them using the courts, using public opinion, using the media, using protest? There are lots of ways that we can do that. But I do think we've got to keep our eye on this. So for me, those are the two big issues, human rights and the environment. But I think beyond that, there are just so many ways that we can look at what's gone wrong with the economy. The economy is so unequal at the moment. The fact that, Trump managed to somehow claim to be an economic populist is absurd, because he's stacked as, as we talked about, he's stacked his administration with some of the wealthiest people in the world. But the idea that there's inequality is true. And, progressives have to work out a way to craft an economic agenda that's going to speak to that, and going to work out ways to rein in the inequality, reverse the inequality. I think we should have a conversation in this country about a wealth tax. People like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders have talked about that for years. If we have an American oligarchy emerging, and we clearly do, people who control so many more resources than anybody else, well, maybe we should work out ways to break up their wealth. Maybe we should sort of say, all right, $10 billion, that's your limit. Well, that's still a stunning amount of money. Why does Elon Musk need $320 billion? How is it conceivable that one human being should control resources more than the entire annual budget of the state of California? How is that conceivably fair or justified? And I think those are messages that will resonate. So I do think there are areas that there's room for progressives to craft really interesting policies and to reshape the political alliances again. But at the moment, in one of the weirder paradoxes of American history, at the moment, Trump and his billionaire acolytes have got the mantle of being economic populists. And, it's a con, it's a grift. It's not going to improve the lives of working class people. But we have to create an alternative message to help disattach large numbers of working class voters from the Donald Trump machine.
Well put. Now, do you think one thing I do think the right was so skilled at was messaging and reaching a lot of people that apparently the left didn't reach, who are disadvantaged economically. And is it a matter of like flooding the airwaves, getting more, using more and more media, more and more memes, more and more, like how much do you think is through media? And let me just start with that.
I think a lot of it's to do with the way the media functions, the fact that every story for 4 months was a Trump story. Now, a lot of those stories were negative, but if you're scrolling down CNN or New York Times or Fox or whatever it might be, and every single story you see leads with Trump says or Trump did or Trump believes or Trump will do, well, it etches into the brain. I think the media has a lot to answer for. And, there are no easy answers there, because Trump's story, there is something compelling because it's so outrageous what he was saying and doing that, we in the media had an obligation to cover it. But at the same time, if you literally just saturate the airwaves with Trump stories, the oxygen gets sucked out of the room and nobody else can craft an agenda. Nobody else can get their policy viewpoints across, and everybody else is seen in sort of comparison to Donald Trump. And so I do think the way media, and then especially social media, amplified Trumpism was really important in this last electoral cycle. I think the way Elon Musk laser targeted young men, in particular, low propensity voters who maybe had never voted before, didn't vote for any other race apart from the presidency, but came out to vote for Donald Trump. It's a powerful coalition they created, and it's based around bait and switch. It's based around, they push cultural war issues, whether it's transgendered issues or whether it was gun ownership or whatever it might be. They pushed these cultural war issues and convinced a lot of people that somehow Democrats were out of touch. Well, if you actually look at the economic agenda, Joe Biden, for all his other faults, was the most pro-union president in American history. So why were so many union voters convinced that he was bad for them economically? Kamala Harris's proposals, they may not have been the most programmatic, but she had some interesting proposals out there. $6,000 child tax credits, subsidies for new home buying. I mean, these things would have made a really tangible difference in a lot of people's lives. Expansion of Medicaid, again, these very, very basic nuts and bolts things that would have changed the ability of a lot of Americans to access healthcare, to access nutrition programs, to access affordable housing. None of that's going to happen now. And instead you have government buy for and up billionaires. And that's an extraordinary bait and switch. And, if you want to sort of think of the contortions that you have to go through to end up with a group like the group we now have in power being seen as somehow economically populist, to me, it's extraordinary. But I do think a lot of it's to do with the way that media was used and misused, the way that social media in particular, drummed home these messages to people who weren't necessarily very well informed about the political process.
I totally agree. I really, I could not believe how much so many media channels and venues and were just every single day amplifying Trump. It just to me reminded me of that coaching principle I just talked about. Like, it was focusing on what we so many of us don't want, and keeping, and as you said, suck the oxygen out of the room so that people couldn't hear. And I know a lot of people don't listen to the mainstream news, but like, why weren't we touting the benefits of Bidenomics? Again, like, despite flaws, everybody has flaws, no one's perfect. And the Kamala Harris's proposals were, I really still wonder how many people who voted for Trump did not ever actually have access to Kamala Harris's economic plan.
I think probably a huge number. But you mentioned the word Bidenomics, and I think that probably also speaks to, part of what happened here, that the economy by a lot of metrics was doing very, very well. There was low unemployment, there was high economic growth, and by the middle of this year, inflation was clearly sort of coming back down again. But there is a problem, and the problem is that for 2 to 2.5 years, inflation was extremely high in a way that nobody in this country had experienced in more than 40 years. And that scared people. It completely dislocated family finances, and it made it much harder to afford houses in particular because interest rates soared. So if you're trying to message your administration and your accomplishments, given all of that, it's probably a really, really bad idea to come up with a phrase like Bidenomics, because basically you're owning all of that. And yeah, there's some good stuff there. There's investments, industrial reinvestments, there's the Inflation Reduction Act. There are all these things that were important, and over the long run, assuming they're allowed to stay in place, will create an awful lot of high-tech jobs and an awful lot of infrastructure investments. But in the short term, what it meant was that the Biden team was basically saying, hey, it's all good. We're so happy with the state of the economy. We're going to name it after our president. Well, if you're paying more for basic household goods, and you're certainly paying more for buying a house, and you're certainly paying more for car purchases and all of that, and you hear the term Bidenomics, it leaves a sour taste. And I do think that, one of the problems I had with Biden throughout his presidency, even before, questions arose as to whether or not he was mentally competent enough to be president, but even before then, he seemed to me to be amongst the worst sellers of his own product of anyone I've ever encountered. That the product wasn't bad. Right. He had some really good policies, but he had the worst messaging you could possibly imagine. That's true. It stuns me. How do you go through a presidency for 4 years and fail that dismally to communicate your basic message? And that's partly the fault of Biden. It's partly the fault of the people surrounding him. It's partly his communications team. But for whatever reasons, it was a fiasco from start to finish. He just had no idea how in the year, in the 2020s, how to reach out to people and communicate. And that's a part of leadership. It is. I think Biden deserves a huge amount of criticism for his failure to message over the last 4 years. Because if you can't do it, doesn't matter how good your policies are, you're basically going to be seen as a failure. And in the end, the public saw him as a failure, and now we're bearing the costs of that.
I blame his communication teams. that's
just your point. Your point
is taken. Your point is taken.
I blame his communications team to a point, but I'm always loath to sort of appropriate blame lower down the food chain, because at the end of the day, Biden was at the top of the food chain. He was the one, in charge of it all. If he didn't like his communications team, he could have shaken it up. But the fact was, every time Biden tried to message, he failed. Every time he held a press conference, it didn't work. Every time he sort of reached out to try and communicate to young people, it was a flop. Well, again, I'll say it again. Part of the job of the president of the United States is selling a message. Roosevelt knew that. Bill Clinton knew that. Ronald Reagan knew that. Obama knew that. How come it was so hard for Biden to message his own successes?
No, that's an excellent point. Let me just ask one question about the inflation, because I kept thinking about the sort of global economy and which wasn't fair or right, and like from a privileged point of view, about how, like, of course there's inflation. We're coming out of COVID. We're coming out of disaster. We were sent checks also in Trump's and Biden's time to help us survive and get back on our feet. There's inflation all over the world. Why is everybody blaming Biden? But maybe it's because they called it Bidenomics.
I think partly, and also because America is the most powerful country on earth. So what America does impacts the rest of the world. Now, yes, there would have been inflation regardless, because there were supply chain disruptions. There was huge bottled up consumer demand because of the lockdowns. And when that demand was sort of uncorked, when you sort of added in the supply chain disruptions, I think it was inevitable there was going to be some inflation.
Yeah.
You can probably make an argument that inflation was worsened by the fact that Biden overheated the economy. And then when inflation took off for a few months at the beginning of that, the administration said, this is just transitory, it's just the supply chains working out the kinks, all will get back to normal. And they were way too slow to respond to the fact that there was an inflationary crisis that was accelerating. So, yes, you're right. The whole world experienced inflation, and a large part of that was just the inevitable byproduct of this calamitous pandemic. But there were some policy choices that were made that maybe could have been made differently, that could have tamped down that inflation or brought it to heel earlier and quicker. And so, I think it's fair enough to say that's one of Biden's failures. There are many successes. As I said, you look at some of the legislation they passed, the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of the investments in infrastructure, a lot of the investments in environmental policy, they were really, really important. And, they were some of the most important domestic law legislation passed in the last 50 years. But take the good with the bad. At the same time, there was bad. And if you're going to own the good, you have to own the bad. They didn't succeed in inflation in 2021 and 2022. By the time they, pivoted and did begin paying attention to it, a lot of people were hurting. And I think that contributed to the anti-incumbency mood. It wasn't the only thing that led to anti-incumbency, but it definitely contributed to it.
So I have another question about reaching more people and like what was missed in reaching, and not to blame people, but I'm wondering again who didn't have access to information. And sometimes it's because people are working, like myself, more than one job. Like who has time to go do your political research when you're raising kids and working and trying to just keep your life together. But I keep thinking, wondering how many people, because I forgot the number of followers, but just for example, I'm going to mention Joe Rogan and his podcast. I forgot how many followers he has, with like a ridiculously high number of followers. And I keep thinking, like that little rumor that went around that Kamala Harris was going to be on Joe Rogan. I kept thinking that would be a really good idea, because a lot of people who listen to Joe Rogan probably don't listen to other channels or podcasts that actually have her on to hear her to hear her message. And just I don't know, do you have any response to that? Like that?
Yeah, I mean, given the state of the media ecosystem in this country, given who has the huge podiums, yeah, the Democrats should have done a better job of reaching out to, whether it was Rogan or some of the other people on the conservative and or libertarian end of the spectrum. They should have reached out to them more. Harris tried, but it was too late in the day. The first couple months for candidacy, and again, she was creating a candidacy from scratch with almost no notice. This was an extraordinary ask in a way. And I think the first month and a half, she was just finding her feet. And then there was this policy, or not policy, there was this sort of idea, which I think was misguided, that she should only be giving interviews in very controlled environments. And I think, again, hindsight's everything, but they were quite risk averse. They didn't want to sort of play hostage to fortune. They thought that Trump was seen as so extreme that, all they had to do was play safe, and 52% of the public would reject Trump. And it turned out that they were wrong a little bit, that, about 50% of the public was okay with Trump. And in the swing states in particular, where there was this, laser focus to get low propensity voters, young men in particular, out to vote, in the swing states in particular, that proved devastating, because yes, well-educated people heard Harris's message or heard Liz Cheney's message or heard John Kelly's message about fascism, and it raised warning signs. But an awful lot of people, that messaging, it just apparently didn't mean anything. You know, the sort of moral dangers of what fascism was just didn't really sink in. What did sink in was the economic messaging, and what did sink in was the cultural war messaging. And the right wing was very, very good at relentlessly hitting on those issues. And so, yes, I think with hindsight, Harris should have reached out to some of those outlets like Joe Rogan. I don't know if Rogan would have had her on, but, you know, the outlets that had the potential to reach into the homes of those voters who weren't being moved by the messaging around authoritarianism or around fascism. But she didn't do that. And, you know, I think at the margins that may have made a difference of a few thousand votes here, a few thousand votes there. And those margins were really important.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I reached out. I invited her team to have her on the show, but they didn't get the message.
Oh, well.
No, thank you for like confirming that. I mean, surely that was a big miss. And I remember feeling so frustrated, like, speak to other audiences. They're out there.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about, because we have about 9 minutes left. You were talking on one of I watched a YouTube video of a talk you did about, forgive me, I can't remember the full title of your book on chaos.
So the book is Chaos Comes Calling, The Battle Against the Far-Right Takeover of Small Town America. Came out in September.
Thank you. And you were talking about an example of a small town in Washington and a state in a small town in Shasta in California, Northern California. And it was interesting because you were talking about kind of like cycles and rhythms, and like culture wars can only last so long, and they can have a big flashpoint, and then they can kind of burn out, because when people realize that it doesn't really affect me if there are some minor percent of people are trans, that doesn't really affect whether or not I can buy a house. Like, why am I preoccupied with that? Like, there's other things to think about. So anyway, can you talk a little bit about like how these I'm thinking of like Hegel, like how these political movements can shift and present us with a vision of directions that the U.S. can move into, that maybe would give us a little bit more, like, energize us and more hope about how to, proactively resist acts towards authoritarianism?
Yeah, so when I was reporting my book, I focused on two places. So one of them was a county in Washington State. It was called Clallam County. It's on the Olympic Peninsula. Within that, I focused on a small town called Sequim. And the other was this quite far-right county in Northern California called Shasta County, where the board of supervisors had been taken over by just extremely hard-right characters in the pandemic period. And in both Washington and Shasta, in Sequim and in Shasta County, one of the things that happened was that as the counties veered rightward, the first thing that took a hit was public health, because basically you had the public health officers in the pandemic proposing public health measures, as they were supposed to do, and the local governments, instead of backing them, basically going to war against them. And that gave a stamp of approval for all these crazies on the internet in particular to come out of the woodwork and threaten, harass, intimidate, do all kinds of blood-curdling emails and instant messages to these public health officers. And that's very, very dysfunctional, because it ends up sort of making rational response to crisis almost impossible. But then the second thing that happened was, beyond public health, you had this sort of raft of measures that these hard-right governments would take that made it harder to keep community services going, housing services, drug treatment programs, mental health services, all these things that are the sort of bread and butter of local government. And over time, in both places, local government, it didn't grind to a halt, but it became increasingly dysfunctional. And what you saw in Sequim in particular was a reaction against that people pretty much across the political spectrum looked at what was happening and realized that nothing was getting done, that the communities that they were living in were suffering, not just in the abstract, but in very concrete ways, that the things that local government was supposed to do to make lives better weren't getting done. And they formed this group called the Squim Governance League. And it had independents, it had liberals, it had Democrats, it had quite a lot of moderate Republicans as well. And the Squim Governance League basically set to work educating locals. And they started knocking on doors, they started holding community meetings. And then by 2022, they were ready to run slates of political candidates. They were very effective. They won at the city council level, they won at the school board level, there were a series of different committees and different agencies that had elected officers, and they won wherever they ran. And to me, it was a lesson that if you're looking what happens in an authoritarian moment when the public, actually realizes this isn't working, well, one of the things that needs to happen is real grassroots organizing and building up power again from the ground up. Because ultimately, I do think these sort of very extreme movements like MAGA, they are slightly cult-based. And I also think they burn themselves out because they're so extreme. And people get tired of screaming after a while. And, after a while, people want the basics. They want government that works. They want potholes filled in the streets. They want schools that work for the kids and so on. I think one of the things we're going to see in the next few years, especially if these huge cuts to government services go in, which, is Ramaswamy and Musk's dream, it won't be smooth sailing. If you cut food stamps the way they're talking about it, or you cut Medicaid the way they're talking about it, an awful lot of people are going to start realizing this doesn't work. I traded my vote. I voted for these guys because they were talking about immigration, they were talking about the border, they were talking about transgendered issues, whatever it was that brought people into the Trump coalition. So I voted for them for this, and now I find that I can't access food stamps, or now I find that my kids' schools are closing, one afternoon a week because there's no funding for schools, or now I find that avian flu is taking off, and turns out that the public health officers now in charge don't have the faintest idea what they're doing. That is going to have a huge impact. And I do think that, if there is a way out of this mess, and it's going to be messy and I can't imagine it happening quickly, but if there is a way out of this mess, it's going to be in reaction to the sheer dysfunction that Trump's government promises, because it does. Every single day of the last administration was dysfunctional, and there's every indication of the Trump administration in 2016 to 2020 was dysfunctional, and there's every indication the same thing's going to happen this time. It will be filled with personal drama. It will be unable to implement most of the policies it's trying to implement, and the ones it does implement will be destructive, and after a while the public's going to turn on that.
Thank you for that illustration. That totally makes sense. And I just want to give you the opportunity. We have just a couple minutes. Do you have a closing thought before I thank everyone?
I mean, look, I really enjoyed this conversation because you asked questions that took us on, a wide journey. And I think that's important. I guess my closing comments are, this is too big an issue to think about in silos. So if your issue is immigration, that's great, but also look at what's happening around environmental policy. Or if your issue is trade union representation or workers' rights, that's fine, but also look at the damage being done to the healthcare system. There are all these ways that things are interconnected. The book I wrote, Chaos Comes Calling, tries to sort of, connect all the dots. But I do think that over the coming years, that's important, connecting the dots, looking at the way this plays out holistically rather than in these sort of different silos. And the final thing is, look, there's going to be an awful lot of temptation to just pull back and disengage because people are going to be so depressed and miserable about what's coming down if they're progressives. It's a bad response, because ultimately the only way we get out of this is to stay engaged and stay paying attention and to continually focus in on and highlight, all the nefariousness that's going to come down over the coming years. Stay
engaged, participate, break out of silos, work together, and communicate across differences. Thank you so much, Sasha Abramsky. I really appreciate your time, and I want to thank our listeners and viewers, and our engineer Rebel, and our producer Dean Piper, and remind everyone to tune in next Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Talk4TV and W4CY.com. Thank you so much, and may we all have more enriching conversations in diversity. Have a good Thanksgiving.
Inarticulate speech of the heart. articulate speech in Lottie.